Welcome to the Divorce Survival Guide podcast, where we have open and honest conversations about co-parenting, separation, divorce, and the hardest question of all, should you stay or should you go? I'm Kate Anthony, your divorce survival guide, and I'm here to help you navigate some of the roughest waters you've ever swum in and answer some of your toughest questions. I've been to hell and back. And now it's my mission in life to help you get to the other side of this process with your sanity and your heart intact.
Hey everyone, welcome back. So, I didn't say this last week. I think it's important to say that October is Domestic Violence Awareness Month. And so while I am using this platform this month to educate about getting out the vote and how important your vote as a woman is in this election, it is also important in shifting and changing the dynamics of domestic violence in this country. So while I am not specifically focusing and highlighting domestic violence this month, everything I do, every single systemic change that I am asking to be made and that I'm asking you to vote for is about protecting women from all forms of domestic violence, in case you didn't know that was my mandate anyway. So today I am incredibly honored to have with me Mona Sinha. She is the Global Executive Director of Equality Now, which is an organization that campaigns for legal and systemic change around the world to address violence and discrimination against women and girls. For 25 years, Mona has leveraged her corporate experience to launch, lead, or advise over 90 mission-aligned organizations to create a gender-equal world. She is the board chair of Women Moving Millions and serves on the executive council of the Smithsonian American Women's History Museum, as well as the advisory board of Gucci Chime. Creating inclusive communities is at the center of her strategic approach, which she believes is the key to unlocking sustainable organizational growth. Mona's bio is epic. So I'm going to read a little bit more of it. And then if you want to read more about Mona and her work, it'll be in the longer bio will be in the show notes. But Mona has received wide recognition for her work to advance equality in 2023. She was listed in Forbes 50 over 50 for her impact as a leader driving change for a better future. She's the recipient of the 2023 Horton Award for Excellence in Social Enterprise from Columbia Business School and CARE USA's 2021 Impact Award. She was presented the Last Girl Champion Award by Gloria Steinem and Apni App in 2017 and the Ellis Island Medal of Honor in 2015. She's also received awards from Smith College, Children's Hope India, Modern High School in Kolkata, Women's E-News, and Breakthrough. Unbelievably accomplished and an incredible scholar and sort of ambassador to change and protecting women and our rights. And I am honored today to have Mona with me to talk about something that is near and dear to both of our hearts, and at the core of the work that she does, which is the Equal Rights Amendment, and the fact that the Equal Rights Amendment has not been certified as part of our Constitution, despite the fact that it has been ratified by 38 states, which is what is required. And I have this incredible conversation with Mona, so I am going to shut up and let her speak to the importance of the Equal Rights Amendment in our Constitution, in our lives, in our world. Without further ado, here is my conversation with Mona Sinha. Mona, thank you so much for being here. I am really, really excited about this conversation.
I am too. The ERA is something very near and dear to my heart.
Yeah, it's essentially your life's work at this point, isn't it?
Yes, it really is. And the fact that it was first proposed in 1923 and we're at 101 years, it's one of the most simple amendments I've ever seen, putting protection for women and other marginalized gender directly into the United States Constitution where it belongs.
Mm-hmm. And so, yeah, I want to talk a little bit starting with sort of an overview of the history, right? It was first proposed in 1923, as you said, and it is very simple. I was looking at some other amendments and the wording, the sections, and how long they are. The ERA is really, really short and really clear.
It is 52 words, and it literally has the power to act as fundamental legal remedy against sex discrimination for both men and women. It essentially equalizes the rights of men and women. And around the world, women only have 75% of the legal rights of men. And in this country, they have zero.
Interestingly, there is a sort of a call, right, that we are actually in violation of international law because 85% of all other UN member states have provisions in their constitutions that we don't have.
That's right. It's actually more. It's only 7 countries in the world have not signed the CEDAW Convention, which is a convention on eliminating violence and discrimination against women. The United States is one of those 7, and the other 7 countries are tiny nation states like Tonga and Palau. So it's quite shocking, actually, that the United States has not ratified CEDAW. And I think partly because they don't have an equal rights amendment in the Constitution.
So the ERA has been ratified, right? So I just actually want to talk through, for those who may not know, for those for whom U.S. history and constitutional history was a really long time ago in their education, what is the process of having a constitutional amendment added? Like, how does this whole thing go?
So it's interesting, there are only 27 amendments that have been added to our Constitution in its relatively long life. And the process can be very simple or it can be very arduous. I think that one of the constitutional amendments took about 200 years to be added. So we're not the longest cycle, even though it's quite shocking. So the ERA has been ratified because Virginia signed it as the 38 states that was required to ratify the amendment in 2020. And it's technically met all the requirements to be accepted as a constitutional amendment, but it's not a part of our Constitution. There are lots of little loopholes that people are citing as a reason why it hasn't been put into the Constitution. And one of them was that there was a time limit placed on the ratification of the ERA in 1982 when it hadn't met 38 states. I think we were stuck at 35. So the last 3, no surprise, came post the 2016 election very quickly. But at that moment, there was this loophole that said that it needed 38 states and it had a 7-year time limit, which obviously expired. But the technicality is that the states didn't vote on that. The states voted just on those simple words that make up the Equal Rights Amendment.
So this 7-year time limit was sort of arbitrary, right?
It was arbitrary, but that is what's being held up when people say, well, it's dead or it hasn't been ratified, the time limit. But the point is the time limit was in a preamble. It wasn't even part of the language of the amendment. So the path to the ERA was very interesting, Kate, because in 2020, when Virginia as the last state approved the amendment, technically all 38 states had approved it. For all the 27 amendments that have been placed in the Constitution before this, it is the duty of the Archivist of the United States to take an approved amendment and place it in the Constitution. That's it. Done. Period. When this was approved in January of 2020, President Trump was in power, and the archivist made the mistake or the error of talking to the Department of Justice to ask for permission to place it in the Constitution, which he did not have to do. At that point, President Trump came back and said, do not put it in the Constitution. The ERA is dead. So his hands were tied.
the reason that he did this was this because of the time frame, because of this like weird 7-year thing, or that was
Yes,
sort of.
I think there was some, question in his mind, but he should have actually just talked to someone, a constitutional scholar or somebody like that to get clarity on this instead of going to the Department of Justice. But when President Biden came to power, he actually did say that that letter was not valid, but he didn't direct him to put it in the Constitution even then. Just that's all he needs to do.
So let's say we get a woman president.
Mm-hmm.
Can she just sort of by executive order at this point say, oh, archivist, sir, go put that in the Constitution?
She can absolutely second President Biden's directive that this letter was not valid.
Mm-hmm.
And she can say, Mr. Archivist or Mrs. Archivist or Ms. Archivist, you can now do your job. It means they can just put the amendment in the Constitution, instead of which it was flipped back to the Supreme Court and to the legislature, which we know is a very fraught process. So right now, in fact, there is a bill in both houses that says the ERA has actually met all of its constitutional requirements and just needs to be put in. And that just needs to come to the floor for a vote. And there is now, because everybody is so up in arms about this, because it's just irregular procedure, that they have, there's a constitutional caucus, an ERA caucus now in our legislative bodies that is fighting to have this embedded in the Constitution. So it could happen in a very simple manner. And that's what people don't understand, because people are caught up with this whole 101-year journey.
Right. That it's like, it's right there. It's right there. It's just waiting.
Right there. It's literally on the doorstep of getting placed into the Constitution. So it needs to happen. It needs to happen now. In September of this year, for example, the Census Bureau revealed that for the first time in 20 years, the gender wage gap has widened. Oof. So, these are the real life impacts of having the ERA. And it would, if it had been in the Constitution, it would have been unambiguous to say to, legal challenges to that you actually cannot discriminate based on sex, any kind of gender-based discrimination. In areas, I'm using the wage gap as an example, where women are still making 83 cents on the dollar compared to white men, and it gets even lower depending if you're a woman of color or you're another marginalized group. Mm-hmm. So it's in areas such as employment, education, healthcare. We've seen reproductive rights. So for those whose rights are violated, there would be a very clear path to obtaining legal protection and recourse. And of course, what's the hottest decision right now, even in these elections, is the Dobbs decision.
Right.
And as of today, 22 U.S. states ban abortions or have stricter restrictions than when Roe v. Wade was still in effect. And that is a fundamental right of access to health care, including abortion. And it's a matter of equality in denying access as sex discrimination. Because women and people who can become pregnant can never truly be equal if they don't have control over their own bodies. And people don't realize that had we had the ERA, you would not have been able to overturn Dobbs.
Right. And this is why it's so crucial, right? Because there are so many avenues like this, like Dobbs, I think no-fault divorce, all of these things that the ERA would be a barrier to removing these rights from women.
Absolutely, because it says the very simple words are, you cannot discriminate based on sex.
Mm-hmm.
And it's so simple and it's so prescient that this was written 101 years ago, where today the very definition of sex is, questioned and challenged and all of that.
Right.
But the fact that this was written 101 years ago as a way of unifying the rights of every person that's an American citizen says something about what the founding fathers were thinking about, right? And the fact is, it needs to be in the Constitution, because that is how people live today, and that is what citizens of this great nation of ours should deserve to have.
So one of the areas that I think this impacts hugely, that's very relevant, especially to my audience, is that the ERA, I talk about this all the time, that the ERA would provide protections for women experiencing domestic violence. So can you talk about how that would happen and what are the gaps in the current legislation that the ERA would fill?
Absolutely. I think this is one of the most important applications of the ERA. If you think about gender-based violence, it can take many forms. So including rape, sexual abuse, intimate partner violence, and certainly reproductive coercion, which we're seeing today. We have data, in fact, that shows that marginalized communities such as Indigenous women, Black women, young women are all disproportionately affected by GBV, gender-based violence. And when these cases are heard in the Supreme Court of the United States, they often fail because the 14th Amendment and other constitutional provisions don't actually provide sufficient protection to uphold these cases based on women's equality. So for example, the Dobbs decision was developed as a result of privacy law. It was not based on discriminatory gender law. And so it was easier to dismantle because, we didn't have the ERA. So there was nothing to say that you can challenge a law that discriminates based on sex. There's nothing in there that says that you can do that. This was based on privacy. Privacy is not such a strong issue area, and it was much more easily dismantled. So there are nuances in the legal challenges that often get lost in the wording of it. And so, for example, if you had the ERA, it would require the Supreme Court to look at cases of gender-based violence through the lens of gender discrimination. And that means they have to apply a higher level of scrutiny. So while there are some federal, state, and local laws that prohibit discrimination and seek to prevent gender-based violence, such as the Violence Against Women Act, the ERA would actually write sex equality and the prevention of sex discrimination into the Constitution, which is much, much stronger. So this cannot be changed. The Violence Against Women Act has to be ratified every year.
Right.
And Congress has to allocate the resources to uphold this law every year. And that makes it less viable and less strong than having it embedded in the Constitution.
And so it's interesting because I was looking at the 14th Amendment, right, and why that falls short. And you have something on your website about, why doesn't the 14th Amendment offer this protection? And I was really shocked because when you look at the wording of the 14th Amendment, all persons born or naturalized in the United States and subject to the jurisdiction thereof are citizens of the United States and of the state wherein they reside. No state shall make or enforce any law which shall abridge the privileges or immunities of citizens of the United States. Nor shall any state deprive any person of life, liberty, or property without due process of law, nor deny to any person within its jurisdiction the equal protection of the laws, right? So it sounds like the 14th Amendment would cover this. But then in 1976, something happened where the court found that men and women could be treated differently under the law. I love this. If such treatment served as, quote, an important governmental objective. So if the government decides, so I'm thinking of Dobbs, right? Where if the government just decides that it's important, that it serves some objective, then it can sort of override the 14th Amendment?
So this is the interesting thing. When the 14th Amendment to the United States Constitution was adopted in 1868, the Equal Protection Clause, which guarantees equal protection of the laws, did not apply to women. So when it was first written, it was not applied to women. So it was not until 1971 that the United States Supreme Court said equal protection, can apply to sex-based discrimination. However, women have never been entitled to full equal protection, as the court subsequently ruled that statutory or administrative sex classifications were subject to an intermediate standard of judicial review. So, when I was talking about if the ERA had been there, there would be strict review of the law.
Yeah.
Because it's not an amendment, there is a lower standard that is applied to the judicial review or based on discrimination. So essentially, it's telling you that because you don't have an amendment in the Constitution, you're allowed to look at any law that's dealing with sex discrimination at a lower standard. So the Constitution doesn't require discrimination on the basis of sex. The issue is whether it prohibits it. It doesn't prohibit it.
It doesn't prohibit it. Amazing. Yeah. We're going to take a quick break. And when we get back, we're going to talk about some of the specific ways that the passage and the enshrinement of the ERA in our Constitution can affect the landscape around gender-based violence. So everybody stay tuned.
I'm Margaret.
And I'm Amy.
And together we host the podcast, What Fresh Hell? Laughing in the Face of Motherhood.
Margaret, I would say you're sort of a where are my keys kind of mom.
Correct. Sometimes a where are my kids kind of mom. Well, you're, Amy, more of a we were supposed to leave 35 seconds ago, mom.
I mean, touche. In each episode of What Fresh Hell, we come at a topic from our usually completely opposite perspectives. I bring the research.
And I bring kind of the gimlet eye. Like, is that research really going to work, people?
And almost 10 million downloads later, we're still laughing.
We also talk to experts in the parenting field, plus parents with stories we can all learn from.
We make each other laugh, we challenge each other's assumptions, and we have what we think is the best parenting community on the internet.
Check out What Fresh Hell? Laughing in the Face of Motherhood wherever you listen to podcasts.
No one told us the truth about parenthood. Why? This is the podcast everyone needed before they had kids, because now that those little ones are here, there is a lot to unpack. I'm Rachel Shepardota, and I am your host for the podcast No One Told Us, where we tell the truth about parenting and let you in on all the stuff you really should have known about before having kids. I am the founder of Hey Sleepy Baby, but this podcast is so much more than sleep. We'll be diving into all the topics that you really care about and need to know while you do your best job raising those adorable tiny humans. Our goal is to just make you feel less alone and less overwhelmed. There are so many things that no one tells us before becoming a parent, and I think that we should really pull back the curtain on becoming a first-time or second-time mom or dad to share the good, the bad, and the ugly. We'll have a little education, a little fun, and a whole lot of heart that goes into each and every episode. So join me and our amazing guests each week to hear us talk about what no one told us.
Okay, we are back. Before the break, we were talking about the ways in which our current protections fall short of protecting us, protecting women. So what are some specific ways that certification of the ERA might affect the legal landscape around gender-based violence, including especially domestic violence cases and the family court system?
Fundamentally, if the ERA were to be enshrined in the Constitution, then there would be an express prohibition on sex-based discrimination. So what does that mean? So in gender-based violence, I'm going to give you an example so you have a sense of what I'm talking about.
Yeah.
There was a woman called Jessica Lenahan who brought a case against the town of Castle Rock for failing to enforce an order of protection against her abusive ex-husband. This man then went on to tragically kill their 3 children.
Mm-hmm.
But the Supreme Court ruled against Jessica, saying she did not have a constitutional property interest and therefore denied her justice.
Mm.
Now, had the ERA been in place, the court would have applied stricter scrutiny of her case, which we talked about, strict scrutiny, right?
Right.
And they would have analyzed how failing to protect gender-based violence and protect a victim and her children is a form of sex discrimination. And therefore, the inequality is a violation of her rights.
Mm-hmm.
You see the nuance of it?
I do.
She wasn't protected because the ERA was not a constitutional amendment or in the Constitution. And therefore, she was denied justice. Which is crazy when you think about this. The person that she wanted an order against because she was afraid of the violence was actually able to kill their 3 children, and the Supreme Court denied her case.
What's interesting is that there are protections, as we talked about in the Violence Against Women Act now, in the form of Caden's law for things like this. But again, that is a law that has to be passed in every state. in order for it to be actual legislation.
It also has to be passed by Congress. So, every couple of years when Congress turns over and you have new people sitting in those seats, it's up to them to say whether it's going to pass and whether it's going to be funded.
Right, which is why your down ballot votes matter so much.
Exactly.
So, there's an interesting thing that always comes up in my mind, because I hear from men all the time about, that it's the idea that it's gender based. And I can hear the not all men or the women are abusers too crowd saying things like, well, we're abused too. So this isn't gender based. So it would somehow skirt around the protections for women.
Actually, no, because it doesn't allow for discrimination based on sex. It's not specifying what sex they're talking about.
Mm-hmm.
Which is why it's a very inclusive amendment.
Right.
Because even in today's world where, sex is not just binary necessarily.
Right,
it protects the range of sex discriminatory policies. It's quite forward thinking, and it's amazing that it was actually written 101 years ago.
Right, because they didn't actually specify. That's actually really interesting. So that sort of leads into this conversation about some misconceptions that people might have about the ERA and how those misunderstandings actually influence opposition to it. I'm thinking primarily, of course, of Phyllis Schlafly to begin with. Mm-hmm. And if anyone, for those who don't know who Phyllis Schlafly was, Mona, can you give us a little rundown of her opposition?
So like I mentioned to you, through 1977, the amendment had received 35 of the necessary 38 state ratifications, right, which it needed to be fully ratified. And then the 3 states that ratified came in post-2016. It included, interestingly, at that time, bipartisan support, including both major political parties, both houses of Congress, and presidents Nixon, Ford, and Jimmy Carter, which was really interesting, right? Mm-hmm. So it seemed destined for ratification until Phyllis Schlafly came on the scene, and she mobilized conservative women to oppose the ERA. And they argued that the ERA would actually disadvantage housewives. Mm-hmm. Because it may cause women to be drafted into the military and to lose protections such as alimony and eliminate the expectation that mothers obtain custody over their children, which is actually not true in divorce cases. And some labor feminists were opposed to the ERA on the basis that it would eliminate protections for women in labor law. Although over time, more and more unions actually have labor feminist leaders and, they are supportive of it. But this was a little known fact that Gloria Steinem talks about is Phyllis Schlafly was actually widely supported by the insurance industry.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah. And people don't talk about this because the insurance industry actually gains from women not having equal protection because they make more money off of women's insurance than they do from men. Isn't that interesting?
Well, so how is that? Say more about that.
Because if you think about it, what do women go through in terms of medical needs, right? Women go through childbirth, women go through...
Oh, I see.
Different things we have more medical interventions in our life cycle than most men do. It's a fact. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And so there was this pushback on the insurance companies that if they had to legalize the same principles dependent on sex, they couldn't discriminate based on sex. What they charged for insurance policies, they would lose. Very interesting because they were very quiet about it. And she and some of the conservative women were actually funded by the insurance industries. I don't know if those laws still exist. They may have been right-sized by now. But at that moment in 1977, this is what was going on.
Fascinating. If you guys want to learn more about Phyllis Schlafly, I highly recommend watching Mrs. America on Hulu. I think it's just such an incredibly well done series.
It is a well done series, but I will point out the one reason I disliked that series was because it positions the ERA as a catfight between two women, and it really wasn't. Yeah, it really wasn't. It was a setup in a sense because Phyllis Schlafly was acting for this industrial complex of institutional companies, insurance companies. It positioned Gloria Steinem as being the person who was opposing her, but in some effect, it was a setup. And it actually was, this is what we see in the world today, is that there's systemic discrimination, and it's often positioned as two opposing women fighting each other, but it just wasn't that. It wasn't true.
That's so interesting. So it almost sounds like Phyllis Schlafly was sort of a pawn of the system.
You may not even have realized it,
And
honestly.
right. That's really fascinating. I did not know that. Thank you. Thank you for sharing that. That's really interesting. Yet again, you're going to position women in a way that they kind of, there's a no-win situation for them. That's great.
Exactly.
Right.
Yeah.
Ta-da.
Exactly. I mean, women are by and large supportive of each other. And there's this false narrative that, women are their own worst enemies. And I think that's just needs to be debunked.
I love that, because our actual collective support is so powerful that it actually, the patriarchy sort of depends upon it being undermined.
Exactly. And, having control over our bodies is the only way that they can do that, or one way that they can do that, because that's not something that they can actually exercise.
So interesting. All right. So let's talk about a couple more of these misunderstandings. What are some other misunderstandings that people have about the ERA?
Well, for example, how it intersects with reproductive rights when it comes to women's bodily autonomy in the context of domestic violence, for example. So in my opinion, and I think people can agree with that anyone who becomes pregnant must have the right to make important life decisions about their own reproductive rights, have access to abortion, and a full range of other reproductive health care matters, no matter where they live. I think denying access to abortion is sex discrimination, because women and people who can become pregnant can never truly be equal if they don't have control of their own bodies and reproductive lives, decide when they want to have children, how they want to have children, how those children get taken care of, for example. And by enshrining equal rights on the basis of sex into the Constitution, the ERA would enable and encourage the legislative and judicial branches to both defend against restrictive abortion laws and bans that we're seeing across our country today, as well as proactively extend protections to safeguard access to reproductive rights and healthcare. And we've already seen, like, some states are now adopting state-level ERAs, really interesting. And in Pennsylvania, for example, the Pennsylvania Supreme Court decided this case called the Allegheny Reproductive Health Center versus Pennsylvania DHS, which involved a challenge to statutory restrictions on the use of state Medicare funds for abortion. And the court held that abortion access is a sex discrimination issue, which then it triggered the application of Pennsylvania's ERA, which is a state-level ERA. And this emphasizes once again that the government chooses to provide medical care to people with low income. They must not intrude upon the constitutional right to full reproductive autonomy, which includes the right to terminate a pregnancy. So you see how it works through.
Interesting. How many states, do you know how many states have their own ERAs?
It's gaining a lot of traction. It's state ERAs are becoming a thing, thank goodness. And I think, let me just look it up. I think right now, 23 states have adopted state constitutions.
Wow.
Or constitutional amendments that prohibit the denial of equal rights under the state law based on sex. And there are some on the ballot this election season. So
that's wonderful. That's amazing. I love that. All right. We are in election season right now. So
right now.
And that's why we're doing this series. I am doing this series because I want women to understand how important their vote is, that it's not, it is important to so much more than just whatever else you may be thinking of it as, right? Like this election cycle is so incredibly important. So what role do you think this election will play in either advancing or stalling the ERA's progress? And especially women, how should they keep this issue in mind when they're casting their votes?
So let me just highlight the irony of this. This is an interesting election year because despite reaching the highest office in the nation, if a woman, and we hope it's her, were elected president, she would still lack explicit equal protection under the US Constitution without the Equal Rights Amendment.
I mean,
think about that.
Right.
So the US Constitution should guarantee equal rights for all citizens, regardless of sex or gender. So even the president, if she were to be elected, would not have equal rights under the US Constitution. And honestly, the ERA is not just about women's rights. It's about upholding the values of equality and justice that define our very nation, regardless of one's identity, sex, whether gender identity, economic status, or sexual orientation.
Mm-hmm.
So it's really a law for all of us.
Interesting.
And I think it's just ironic in this situation that even if a woman were elected as president of the United States, she would still not have equal rights under the Constitution.
Incredible. Okay, we're going to take one more quick break and then we'll be right back. Before the break, we were talking about this election and how important it is, especially for the ERA, but also the irony of the fact that if elected, our president wouldn't have equality under our Constitution.
That's right.
Which is absolute insanity. What do we need to keep in mind? Like, as women go to the ballot box and as they're voting, not just for president, but all the way down the ballot, is there something that they can look for? I'll say, like, the voter guides are so confusing. There are so many things on the ballots. I live in California. We just got our voter guide. And my son, who's 19, who's voting for president for the first time, is really taking this seriously. And he starts reading through this voter guide and he's like, none of this makes any sense to me. What can we be looking for in making these decisions?
I know, it is so confusing, isn't it?
Mm-hmm.
I think, first of all, every one of us has a duty of care. And every one of us who elects an official, whether it be at the city level, the council level, the state level, the national level, has to hold these individuals that we give great power to accountable. And the ERA is already ratified. Politicians and individuals who are making these critical decisions about our lives need to know that. And so we need to go out and ask candidates they want to represent us, where do they stand on gender equality? It impacts all Americans. So where do you stand on gender equality? You can go to the ERA Coalition website and they have a scorecard. You can actually type in any name of anybody standing for election. It'll tell you where they stand and how they voted on gender equality.
Oh, that's great.
Yeah, because honestly, gender equality is the most important thing. It's not a women's issue. If gender equality were a women's issue, it would be long solved by now. It's also a men's issue because it affects communities, it affects countries, it affects the economic power that women can hold in a nation state. There is a statistic that's outstanding out there, which the World Bank put out, to say that if we had gender equality or even gender parity, we'd actually add $28 billion to the global GDP.
Wow.
Think about that for a second. It's an economic decision that we're making by leaving half the workforce out of equality and equal laws. So that's what we have to think about. We have to think about, in our own country, where are we? If we are sort of a leading nation in the world, it's just irony that we don't have equal rights. And we're one of 7 countries in the world, the others being tiny nation states, that don't have equal rights in the world. So advocacy organizations working on child marriage, working on economic rights, working on FGM, or female genital mutilation, which even happens in this country, sexual violence, gender-based violence, international human rights law, the list can go on and on and on. The ERA can be a tool for you, because if you visit the I Need Our ERA on our website, it's a series written by our team of international lawyers. They dive into these specific areas and how the ERA can be a remedy to provide protections for further pathways to justice for those facing any kind of sex discrimination. So it's a very important constitutional amendment that needs to be in there. And when you look at it from an international perspective, as I mentioned to you, the US is certainly an outlier. 85% of all other UN member states have a provision within their constitution that specifically addresses gender equality. And the US has a lot to learn from other countries. It is literally the only high-income country, for example, without guaranteed maternity leave. Let's think about that.
Seriously, let's think about that. And let alone also paternity leave, right? So we're way behind most developed nations on paternity leave.
We're way behind on some issues like equal pay for countries like Saudi Arabia. So, it's like some of these countries have such a bad rap and people use them as sort of being backwards. But honestly, we're not that much better. We've come a long way, but we have to do better. And frankly, the ERA is the foundation for that.
Mona, I just want to thank you so much for this conversation. I've learned a ton. I'm sure my audience has too. You guys have an election guide on your website. Is that what?
Yes.
Okay. And I'm going to make sure that is highlighted in the show notes so everyone can look for that, because voting is confusing, but this issue is so paramount, and it is so paramount now. It's really important now for all of the reasons we've discussed. EqualityNow.org is such an incredible resource and just incredible amounts of information. Where would you like people to go to find out more?
Thank you, Kate. Well, certainly go to our website. We have a lot of research on our website. You mentioned the guide. That's certainly there as a toolkit for everybody. And all I would say is, please vote. Vote like your life depends on it, because this year it really does.
Amen. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Kate, for having me on and having this important discussion. Let's get the Equal Rights Amendment into our Constitution and make sure that nobody, not a single human being in America is discriminated based on sex.
Thanks for tuning in to another episode of the Divorce Survival Guide podcast. If you like what you hear, head on over to Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen in and leave me a review. And don't forget to follow me on Instagram at the Divorce Survival Guide. I'll see you next time, and until then, remember, you, my love, deserve to be happy.
Are you a parent in need of a laugh and a little escape? Look no further. Parenting is a Joke is the podcast you've been waiting for. Hey, I'm Ophira Eisenberg. I'm a stand-up comic and parent. And each week I chat with one of my top comedian pals who, just like you, are juggling careers, busy lives and schedules, and raising a family. You can expect candid stories, hilarious mishaps that happen on stage and at home, and just a lot of laughs. There's no expert advice here. Well, actually, sometimes a good idea does sneak its way in, but mostly just pure, relatable fun to remind you that we're all in this parenting adventure together. New episodes of Parenting is a Joke drop every Tuesday, so tune in, get ready to laugh, unwind, and maybe even feel a little bit better about your own parenting. Because sometimes that's exactly what your therapist, pediatrician, and bartender ordered. Subscribe now on your favorite podcast platform.